Hey there, it's Ryan, and today we are going to be painting a nice, finely detailed, real-time landscape with acrylic paints. And before we begin, I will run you through our materials. I will be personally working with pigments from Winsor & Newton with my brush set. It is a 5-piece brush set, and I use it for all the lessons here on the channel. With that, I will be working on an 8x10 inch canvas. I have a small dish of water and some paper towel to wipe off all of my excess water and pigment. Now, if you're looking at the image and you're thinking, oh no, I'm not great at drawing, don't worry, I also have the traceable up over on Patreon, so you will get the perspective, the sizing, the details, all of that just right. And up there you can also get things like the reference photos, bonus lessons, we do art critiques, and you can also get my ebooks, which include acrylics for beginners. So if you're interested, check it out, but those are the materials and we are about to get started. So we're going to start here today with the background of the painting, and I wanted to show you what it looks like fairly complete first before we jump into it. That way you have an idea of what we're working towards while we go through the layering process. With that, we do have some very warm rocks over here. We have some beautiful snow, small trees in the distance, and the edges are a little bit more simple, intentionally so that we don't kind of drag the attention to one side or the other, but this is what we're working towards. We're going to do a lot of layering to get there, and yeah, just want you to keep this in the back of your head so you know what we're doing. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we will dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will just help keep our paintbrush wet for a little bit longer. And with that, we'll add a lot of white to a little bit of Mars Black and a hint of Cerulean blue. This should mix a fairly cool gray, and it'll be a great pigment to start applying in our sky. Now, I'm using the larger flat-headed brush, as you can see, because its nice sharp edges allow me to cut around the edges of my rock. And when we want to fill in a large area, we can just apply a bit more pressure, work in an X-shaped pattern, and move that pigment about with real ease. Now, throughout this lesson, I am going to occasionally move the camera a little bit back, move it close up. That way you get to see the details, but you can also get to see it as a whole. I think that's really important, keeping that holistic view of the piece, ensuring things that are out there are working together and they're cohesive. So we'll play around with that. But with that, once I have all of that pigment applied, I do like to go over it with a number of horizontal strokes, very soft, and this is just going to smooth things out and take out any unwanted movements in the applications. From here, we're going to start blocking in our mountains to the left and the right hand side, and we're going to do so with a base layer. Said base layer is also going to be predominantly made of a titanium white, Mars Black, and Cerulean blue, though we're going to start using more Mars Black and quite a bit of it. We still want the blue to keep it a nice cool hue, and that's important so that it's cohesive with the rest of the piece. But here what we're essentially trying to do is create the shadows to build on top of. And we don't want them to be too dark because we want to save our truly dark pigments for the foreground. So we're looking for a mid to dark gray comprised of cooler hues, and I think this one will be great. Now with this, I'm going to continue to use the larger flat-headed brush because it is just so convenient for rendering these intentional, sharp movements. And I lost a little bit of my drawing, but that's okay. We can always go back and redraw it, or we can just see through some of the acrylic. I'm also going to start by applying all of my edges first, rather than working inwards. And I'm doing that because it's a lot easier to apply pigment along sharp edges when you have fresh pigment on your brush, when your brush is still damp. Once you use it quite a bit, it gets difficult. The bristles don't stay together in the same way. So while my brush is damp, I'm just trying to make all of these intentional markings. You can see that I'm really just not always even using the entirety of the brush. Sometimes it's just a portion. And we'll lift that to the top. From there, once we have our kind of funny looking outline, we can start working all of this downwards, doubling down on the edges so that they're nice and thick. We don't want any of the canvas showing through and giving us a bit of a chalky or toothy aesthetic. And I'm going down slightly below where I've drawn my trees. That way we can layer our trees on top of them, at least the larger protruding portions. And again, I know I'm covering up portions of the drawing, that's okay. I will simply go back and redo it. Often the second time we do that, the better it is. Just because, like the background and all of our second layers, we have an opportunity to make adjustments, see what we like, work on what we don't. That's one of the big beauties of acrylics. They're so forgiving and they just render so many opportunities for growth in general. That said, you should probably do a second layer here if you don't feel like it's thick enough. And then we can start building some actual depth to it, which is always a lot of fun. So once that block and layer is dry, we're going to take some additional titanium white, work that into the mix we were just playing with, and make something a bit brighter. The goal here is to start building highlights onto our mountains in areas that are going to receive more light. And while the sky right now has essentially this hazy look to it, the light is fairly spread out. There are going to be areas that get a little bit more, and I think the light's going to be going this way. So we're going to start by just building a little bit of highlight onto this larger open face of rock. And here I am okay with my applications being a little bit textured, a little bit gritty. I think that adds to a nice rock texture. It's incredibly easy. I'm going to do a bit more in the background here because I do want that to be a bit brighter. The farther we get, typically the more washed out the aesthetic is as a whole. So now I'm looking for areas that essentially have an upward trajectory towards the top left corner. So we have one right here. You can see that little bump. I'll apply some highlight in there. There's a hint of a protruding spot through there. This has quite a bit. And again, these are all just the angles of the mountains that are facing that side. So it's pretty intuitive. Things change when we get over here just because the mountains themselves are a bit more interesting. And what we have are the tops of mountains. We can actually see them. They're almost like flat plains. And it's going to work its way down here. I'm just looking at the reference photo. Again, you can redraw. It was in the sketch, but I have a pretty good sight of how it works. And this hypothetically works its way into there. But we'll grab a bit more pigment because I don't have a lot on my brush. So it's all a bit more subtle than we want it. There we go. And then there are also some areas, and I'm going to be subtle with this, that just protrude over here. And I'm just going to throw some texture as a whole into this space when I start to run out of pigment. Okay, so stepping back, now we have essentially a framework for where we're going to add details and highlights. We're going to, yet again, brighten up our mix. And mine is starting to dry on the palette, so I'm just going to make a little bit more of it. But this time, while brighter, I'm also going to interject a hint of burnt sienna. And this is going to warm it. It's going to give it a bit more of an earthy look as well. Then we're going to switch to another new brush, that being the smaller flat-headed brush. This is much like the larger one in that it can pick up a good amount of paint, it can render a sharp implication, but we can do so on a more intentional, smaller scale. And with this, we're going to start building portions of our rock face using, for the most part, a collection of vertical tap and drag effects, trying to make a lot of them quite unique in that I'm not trying to get the same line every time. I'm trying to make some bigger, some smaller. We connect larger areas. We can even use the top of the brush for a little tap. Work this along the edge. But just like that, we are starting to build a good base. I think we're going to cover the entirety of this back rock area with it, and then we'll build additional highlights on it later to instigate some detail. And typically, I know we like early success and beautiful portions in paintings. This is one of those subjects, this is one of those scenes where the longer we work at it, the better it'll look, and it's going to look a little bit unfinished, a little bit rough for a period of time. I know that with these YouTube videos, audience retention is important, and I often try to make a portion look really good, really early, just kind of proof of concept, but this is something that I don't recommend rushing through. We could go in with a much brighter, much more bold, much more saturated initial application here, but realistically, taking our time, going at it like this, the result will just be a lot better. So we're not going to do that. Not today. We're going to work our way through with the slower effect, and I think it'll be pretty great in the end. So let's head on over to the right hand side. Now over here, as noted when we were putting down that initial layer, this area is essentially a larger plane. It's a little bit different. I'm going to paint it in accordance with that idea. So what we're going to do is we're going to add highlight to the top, because we're going to get a lot more highlight up here anyway. But you can see that my markings kind of sweep in this way as if to meet this area. And then it stops and maybe gets a little bit flat, so the markings become a bit more horizontal as we find our way to this edge right here. And then on the back side, we can do more of the horizontal markings, which we have now very quickly become accustomed to. There we go. It's a bit more flat. Might even amalgamate some of the larger markings at the top. And when we do this, we increase the larger general value. We remove detail, but that's okay because we can always go back in with detail of another hue. Something a little bit more prominent. And then from there, the majority of the rest of this is in those tapped vertical markings. As the pigment dries, you'll also notice that it gets a bit darker. Here, I'm using the exact same pigment that we just worked with, but it looks quite different, doesn't it? And that's because this is now dried and this is wet. So it's worth noting that you almost get an opportunity to see what the painting will look like with a much greater highlight, which is great. Very beneficial. One second, I just want to cut the top of an edge for the mountain right through there. Yeah. And then I want to create a bit of a textured, almost splattered look. Various geometric shapes amalgamating together. I'm going to do that in a couple of spots. The rock over here is just a bit less sharply defined. But then when we move up, we get back to more of those vertical tap and drag effects. And the variance between the two will make this so much more interesting. And we also have some of that more abstract, splotchy work down here from the bottom. But you really want to amalgamate various textures and applications. Here we have a lot of texture from the unfinished or partially unfinished initial highlight layer. And when we layer on top of that, we have a new aesthetic, which I think works really well. We'll also make this back area quite bright, as we did there. We'll redo this one actually. We'll just build those up a couple of times. So we've given it a little bit of time to dry, and as a result, not as bright as it once was. A lot of the markings in here barely visible, but again, they give us a framework, a pattern, they give us experience with the application process, and they give us a very subtle base to build on. All that's important. So now we are going to go back to that mix, though this time we go even brighter, right? That's going to be a common trajectory. I'm slowly replacing the cerulean blue in our mix for a burnt sienna. I'm still using a fairly watery flat-headed brush here. And this looks quite bright, quite dramatic in relation to that which we already have. But remember, that's because it's wet, it's because it's watery. I'm going to continue having fun building these areas, and the more you do it, honestly, the more fun it is, just because you get so acquainted with the space and you start to do these micro changes, and it really does start to feel like something you are crafting and almost sculpting out of the rock. So enjoy the process, take your time with it. This is one of those things where we're doing a lot of layers. So inherently it will take time. That's okay. I'm going to do some texture back here, but I'm just going to leave little bits open. Here there's a lot of the darker background showing through. Here there's a very minimal amount of the background showing through. On the very back, there is none of the background showing through. And now we're back to these spots. I'm going to start with the more defining features. And I should certainly start up here. I really liked that somewhat abstract, loose application we did. So we'll really double down on that for a minute. And then we'll return to our more structured variants of application. Looking a little bit more dramatic than I want it to, but I know it's not going to remain this way. I think the beauty of a lesson like this, there's a lot of repetition, and often that helps us really remember, helps us learn, helps us keep it in our head, so when we go to paint it the next time in another painting, we still have it. Now for this next layer, yet again, we are going to change things up. Not dramatically, but we are going to make a step in a brighter direction. And, as you're about to see, we're going to do so with a different brush. So now, I'm actually going to switch over, for the first time, to a liner brush. Great for very minute details. Can't pick up a lot of paint, so I'll have to reload frequently. But it'll get us a sharper marking once we make this damp. It'll just pull all of those bristles together, and just like that, we have a very intentional mark-making device, right? So then we go in, we find the pre-existing highlights, and we begin to rework those in general. That said, this is very detail-oriented, and I will get you closer. Now with this, it's a little bit harder to get those fully intentional, always vertical, and structurally so markings. So I have to be a bit more attentive to our application process. We don't want a lot of twists and turns. We still want this to have a sharper aesthetic. But as you can see, I think it's already making a really nice difference. We can also incorporate it into areas that are a bit darker and just build those. I don't want to do too much to the left and right because I want to keep the attention towards the center for the viewer. And again, in the background, we brighten significantly more, and we leave less negative space. We'll also make this a lot more blue as we proceed, but for now I think that'll work well. Just brightening the value. And with this, I do continuously gravitate to this top area. Which, as we know, is a bit more unique. But does turn into something quite familiar with these elongated markings. Also doing little taps for the first time. So just dots, rather dotting here and there. Adding extra highlight to the tops. We don't want this to get too bright because we still want to incorporate snow and other warmer highlights. bit can help. There we go. And then we've done this a couple of times too. By the time you're done with these mountains, you will have it in your head for the rest of forever. That's a great thing. Now, we've been doing all of these very subtle builds, and I think it's working quite well, but it's time to get into something a bit more dramatic. We're going to start with our burnt sienna, titanium white. You can see this is fairly orange, love that. Hint of Mars black, and the smallest hint of cerulean blue. We still want to make it feel like it fits within the context of the piece, but we do want something a lot brighter. Switching to the flat-headed brush, because I think having that very sharp, elongated look is important for this marking. And with it, we're going to add some brilliant, noticeable orange highlights to the wall here. And these are something that we'll need to build up like everything else, because orange, or rather burnt sienna, is inherently a very thin pigment. Acrylics as a whole are thin, but this especially quite thin, and that's because it's more of a hue. It doesn't have a thick value to it like a titanium white or a Mars black. Let's add some extra titanium white to it. Don't normally use this brush for mixing, but I think it'll work just fine here. Now we'll double down some of the favorite spots. Take the extra pigment off my brush just because I don't want it to be too cumbersome. Getting those sharp markings here is so important. And now for the real refinement, back to the liner. There we go. Little splashes of it throughout. Once it's very watery, I can also apply just a little bit of warm texture to some of the negative space, the shadows. This will help bring it together. You can also do this with a cooler hue, but I do just want a little bit of texture in all of it. Okay, and now we almost have mountains. Still a bit to do. We're going to go in with a darker hue, which is blue dominant, than what we've used previously for the mountains. And I still have the darker hue just showing up right here on my palette, so I need to make sure that I'm going with a bit more Mars black than that. It's still working with the Cerulean. I'm not using any of my burnt sienna for this. I'm going to go in with the liner brush, and I'm going to create some separation in between our rocks. I'm also, for the most part, starting at the bottom and working my way up, because the bottom will have more shadow than the top. It's just farther from the light, right? And a lot of this is linear, but it's also moving in the general direction of the rock itself. I'm also going to create some horizontal markings, small ones, just to break the rock up occasionally. And that'll make it a bit more interesting. Create these shelves of rock. So we're just splitting portions in half. This is a really easy way of establishing additional detail, texture, line work. I'm not going to do too much towards the left-hand side or the right-hand side, really, because again, I think those are areas that we just don't want to draw too much visual attention to, but we will incorporate some so that it fits within the context of the piece. That's so important. Finding ways to make your painting cohesive. And you can see this is something we can do a lot of or a little of. I'll get you closer for this side though. So now we're moving over, left-hand side. Again, like to typically start more from the bottom. Grab a bit more paint. We can create some separations. Need a bit more water on my brush. Condense the bristles, get something that's a bit sharper. And the more we work these applications, the more subtle they become. There's definitely a middle ground for all of that, where you don't want it to be too stark, you don't want it to be too toothy, but you do still want it to have some texture. You do need it to be darker than the previously applied pigments. Here it might actually be a bit brighter. Might also just be that I'm using more water now than I was before, and oh, there we go. That's great. Again, really making use of the horizontal markings to break up pieces. And while we're here, we might also just grab titanium white, burnt sienna. Really solidify the warmth of this rock. Going back and forth between the highlights, the shadows, can typically render the best markings, the best paintings. It's about the balance, right? Okay, so lots of little taps, couple drags. Trying to diversify the oranges as well. Not dramatically, but enough that you feel like the rock has changes in its hue. I like that a lot. Now we're going to take a second and just do a little bit of course correction with the background here. You can see that it's a bit more of a greenish hue. It's not really that cool pigment that I think we need instilled in the background. So we're just going to go ahead and mix up a very desaturated grayish blue. Something not too bright, not too dark, very middle of the road. Using the larger flat-headed brush. Switch on over to, I think, the liner brush for this. And we'll just make sure that these distant mountains have that nice, cool aesthetic. Doing a lot of line work vertically down. Then we can also stretch that into the areas that protrude on the left and right hand side that come a bit closer to us. You can see this hue is somewhat similar to that which we have in the sky, so it all fits well together. We'll let it dissipate as we move forward in space, and then we'll go back and we'll just double down on making that distant portion nice and snowy, nice and blue. Like so. And just like that, I think it's already establishing a much greater distance, depth. You can make it a little bit brighter, establish some highlights, just make it a bit more unique. It's really far in the distance, so you don't want too much detail, but because it's such a small area, I think we're safe. Just like that. That said, it's time to start applying some actual snow. Now with this, we want something that's actually brighter than all of the sky or the blues that we have previously established. So I'm going to grab a lot of titanium white, mix that into what I just used here. So a little bit of cerulean blue, a little bit of Mars black, but it's mostly titanium white, and we can tell that it's brighter, again, than the actual sky. That's our comparison point. I'm going to switch back over to the liner brush. And then we can start building on top of our mountains. There are going to be lots of little areas that protrude, catch that nice little bit of snow. Sometimes it'll run its way down a mountain. Other times it'll kind of collect itself on horizontal portions. But this is a great way of instilling a lot of detail really simply. We have some of the snow piling up at the bottom here. We're going to incorporate lots of little taps for snow. When we create shelves like this, we can have areas that kind of come down. And of course, more little taps in the surrounding areas to establish that it's not just a little isolated area. I know that you're very far away for this part of the painting process. It's intentional because it's so stark. It's easy to get close up and really hyper-focus in a way that doesn't let you balance the painting as a whole. So I really want you to watch this from far away initially. And then when we get to the other side, I'll get you closer to see the actual detail work and how it's all being applied and built. But right now I think it's much more important that we keep that step back, just so you can see how much of each I'm adding in different areas. I'm going to be somewhat careful of the edges to not establish too much light or detail around them. And this side of the rock isn't going to get that much snow, actually. And that's because we just don't have cool rocks. We have a lot of light on them, a lot of sun, and that's going to warm them up. That's going to melt the snow, and it's going to have a dramatic effect. So we can do little hints of it, maybe towards the bottom. But I don't want much towards the top. We can add it later if we feel we need it. And then I'll also add some into the distance here. There we go. See that? 3 minutes of just touching up snow, and it adds so much to the painting. It's going to have an even more dramatic effect over on the other side because there's a lot more surface area for it, a lot more flat planes, as we talked about. So let's jump into there, but a bit closer. Now with this, I am going to start in these more flat areas because we are going to have a lot of snow here. I'm going to apply it somewhat horizontally, somewhat in the nature of the pre-existing highlighted marks. Again, we made a lot of layers through here, and that was in part great practice for this. So I'm leaving little openings. Grab additional pigment, build it up. My brush is fairly watery, so my initial applications are going to be quite thin. There are going to be areas that we want to be opaque, so that just means additional applications once it dries. You don't want to go in too many times when it's still wet, because you'll essentially just be ripping off paint and then reapplying it over and over again. Having that patience is important. Grab more paint. You can see I'm going in with little taps. We get to the larger areas, we move into a drag. There we go. And you can see that I'm slowly starting to connect portions. I apply with openings, I apply in smaller amounts, I apply in thin layers. I sit with it, I live with it, I ask myself, what do I want to do with it? And then I make those adjustments as need be. It's a very reflective process. We're also going to be painting little trees in here, future steps, and the more of the brighter snow pigment that we have, the more they'll stand out. So we're kind of future-proofing for that a little bit when we create the more dominant portions. Okay, very good. I think the contrast of the orange with the snow over here is pretty beautiful. We can also now start splashing on some of the snow to the rocks towards the foreground. We have a train passing right now. You might be able to hear the rumbling. I feel like that's great ASMR for a scene like this, to be honest. Always love the idea of taking trains in the winter. Used to do so quite a bit. About half a decade ago at this point. But I remember one time I was going back home and I was in the most far back trolley. The door to the back of it bursts open and it's a blizzard and all of the snow is streaming in. And everybody's kind of looking at each other like, is this, what do we do? What do we do? Nobody from the train officially is on board. Do we go and close the door? And it was a rather unique experience. But we ended up riding for quite some time with that door just kind of flailing in the background, snow coming in. Made for a fun winter memory. But again, always just loved taking the train around this time of year. Should probably plan a trip now that I think about it. Not like a long one, but maybe a little day trip through some exploration, do a little hike. Here in Canada, we even break out the snowshoes here and there. Right. Kind of finding some of my crevices and filling them with snow right now. Not all of them, but enough. And we'll do little patches of snow towards the top here too. Not too many. Don't want to overdo it. But enough to make it cohesive. So, stepping back, I think that actually added a lot to the painting. There's more of a balance, there's more detail. It feels a lot more realistic. That said, still not done with the background. There are so many little intricate things we can do here to make it special, and we're going to head in now and add some really small trees, which are going to add scale to the trees that we have here in the midground and make those look significantly more proper within the space. Now we'll get quite a bit closer. We'll grab our Mars Black, Cerulean Blue, Titanium White, and we'll mix up not too much of this because we really don't need a lot. We're painting very small trees in the distance. They're going to be this grayish blue because there's a lot of that atmospheric reflective light in the background kind of bouncing around and changing what would innately be a green into something that looks blue from a distance. But we'll paint. This is something that's not too dark, but also not bright. We'll switch over to our liner brush because we need the smallest possible application. Make sure it's nice and damp. Grab that pigment. And then we can start just painting in little triangles into the background. Sometimes they'll overlap and layer with each other. That's important. Going to spread them out pretty sporadically, at least initially. And we do that to make it look natural, right? If it's too properly spaced out and even thought out, it feels not so genuine, not so organic. So I really am jumping around. We'll go back over the areas we like. Trying to make the tops of these strokes a little bit smaller, a little bit sharper than the bottom. I might even apply a little bit more pressure with my brush towards the bottom. That way we get an expansion of the bristles. That makes the top of the tree nice and sharp, gives it a good thick body. But as you can see, it's pretty intuitive, this step. And, we can all have different versions of this. You can have a lot of trees or next to none. It's really up to you and your preference. Now we're going to head over to the left-hand side. And with this, we're actually just going to paint a myriad of little protruding trees on the top of our rocks. Such a quick little detail that adds so much to the painting. There we go. Honestly, I don't think we need much more than that. Yeah, I'm actually quite happy. So, stepping back, I actually really love all those small details. I don't think at this point we need any more, though once we establish the bottom of a painting, we might go back up and touch it up, add some details, maybe brighten portions of this. We'll see what happens, but for now I want to start moving forward in the painting. There's a piece of rock with some foliage on it. It kind of slants in this way. It's a great leading line that points you into the painting, and it's a fairly large area, so I'm going to go in with the larger flat-headed brush. We're actually going to mix a very similar pigment to what we did for the trees. You want it to be quite dark. In fact, we want this to be the darkest pigment we've used yet. It means it needs to be a little bit darker than the shadows that were incorporated into the rocks, but we still want room to make it darker in the future for the foreground, because as we get closer to us in the foreground, typically we can see a little bit more of our darks, or rather our darks get more dark because there's less of that atmospheric light reflecting about. So with this, I'm just going to craft a fairly sharp edge there, work my way back up, and then we'll do a subtle blend downwards. This is all going to be covered by trees in the end, so I'm not too concerned about it. Though, taking a step back, I can tell this is actually a little bit too dark. So, more titanium white in the mix. A little bit more blue. Again, we want something darker than that which we've used before, but we want room to be able to make everything else quite a bit darker than it. So it's a balancing game. And I think we're finding that balance. There we go. Much better. Just going to do a bit of a cleaner line at the top here. We're going to instigate a brighter, slightly more blue area right through here, and this is where some of the just general rock is going to be seen. We switch on over to our liner brush, grab some extra highlight, maybe add a hint of extra titanium white. We'll just tap on little bits of texture in the open rock area. This is going to be a mixture of line work that kind of follows the general movement and pattern that we've pre-established, and just little taps in general. We'll also go for a slightly darker variant that's more akin to what we have in the actual surrounding area. Now, it's worth noting that the vast majority of this isn't going to be seen. Right, we're going to cover up a lot of it. We'll do so soon. But by filling out this larger area with this texture, we give ourselves more option as to where we place our trees in the next step. So we're really just keeping our artistic opportunities in a good place. There we go. Lots of texture. Now we need some greenery, some foliage to kind of line the top and the bottom. And we're still not going to go with actual green for our greenery. It's farther away. We're not going to see it. So we're just going to go with a brighter, more blue variant of our mix there. Well, of our mix here, but it's still going to be a bit darker. We want it to be darker than what we have here, but we want it to be more blue. We want it to be brighter than what we have on the strip above and below. So we'll just do a little test with our brush. Let's make it slightly more blue. Slightly brighter. We're not going in with the first pigment we mix, we're trying to find the right one. And then for the first time, I'm actually going to switch over to my fan brush. This is great for rendering a lot of very small markings quickly. You can see all of those little bristles. We're going to pick up that pigment on both sides. And we're just going to do little taps, maybe a little bit of drag. Going to render the smallest amount of texture. This brush is not damp, by the way. It's still completely dry and intentionally so. That way we keep our bristles together, or apart rather. If we made it damp, the bristles would condense. It's a stiff bristled brush, but it's a fairly special one, and when we add that water, it becomes a soft bristled brush, and we want to work with a stiff bristled right now. So we're just going in with those little taps. You can barely see it, very minute, but it does give you that distant, almost fuzzy, grass-ish aesthetic, and I like that. That'll be great to layer our trees on top of. We can layer a little bit of this onto here too, just to soften it. And I think we'll take a step back. Okay, now we're going to start inching our way forward in the painting and work on some trees that are going to cover what we just did so here, at least portions of it. Now for the pigment, I actually want something very much akin to what we used for the base layer of the top or the bottom. Just something dark, blue, predominantly Mars black. We need a good amount of it. We'll do a little test. And it's close, but to be honest, it could be slightly brighter. Again, we don't go with the first pigment we mix. Test that, and that's great. Okay, now here I'm going to establish the spines of our trees as if we're just painting the middle portion. This is so we know where they're going to go for the most part. We don't want them evenly spaced out because we don't want it to look artificial, so it's okay to have them overlap or kind of crisscross. It's okay for them to be close together and then inevitably lose detail in one because the other will overlap it. All of that's fine. I'm also now going to take the opportunity to just block in the base a little bit. This is just towards the bottom where we know it's going to be nice and thick, and the open canvas that we see through here is a great indicator of that. Just fill that out. Then you can see we're already losing quite a bit of what we just painted through there. Not a big deal, not a bad thing at all actually. And then as we move over here, we're actually getting farther and farther away because the land moves like this. So these trees are going to be a lot smaller. And I'm just going to, here, initially, sketch where we have the distant tree line. We're going to have some snow in front, we're going to have some snow in front, but again, we can cover up the open white canvas, which is always just incredibly cathartic. Always feels great. It's messy, it's the first layer, it doesn't have any depth, but it still feels a little bit better than the white canvas, right? So let's, you know what? Let's switch our brush over to a smaller flathead, and I'll get you a bit closer. Now, we're essentially going to take that smaller flathead, and we're going to create the tops of little trees, make them nice and sharp. The body towards the bottom can of course get larger and larger, we can apply more pressure, but that very top area does need to be applied very delicately. And we'll just work our way over to the right. You're going to want to reload your brush with water fairly frequently, because that's what's going to help tie those bristles together and get you that really intentional small marking. Trying to be somewhat sporadic with these, the same way we were with the trees towards the top. We want them to have different heights, different widths. Randomization really is the key. And then as we get over here towards the right hand side, we can make them a little bit bigger in general, because we're getting closer to us, right? Because here it's very close, and then we move into the background for here, and then we come back out. You know what? With us now, yet again, getting larger, I think I'm going to move the camera just a bit back so you can see us progressing with it very holistically. So here we are, we're a bit farther back. I've switched to the larger flat-headed brush because we do have more physical space to cover. And I like that a lot. You kind of have these larger dips, going over my markings a number of times just to build up the opacity. And now what we can do is we can switch on over to the smaller liner brush, make sure it's nice and damp, grab some pigment, and we can tap on nice little details to the left and right, create some protrusions, and make our trees actually look like trees, you know? Rather than just large vertical markings. And I'm going to try to do so by making each side different from the other. With this brush we can also interject additional silhouetted trees. And while they are all silhouetted right now, don't worry, we are going to go in and apply another value so that they aren't just silhouetted, so that they do have a level of depth. We're just not quite there yet. We want to establish our edges first. We want to establish the personality of each tree. That's important. All of these trees should have their own personalities. And I'm going to finish up this side, again with you a bit farther away, and then we'll do the other side but close up. That way you can see the details. But while we're adding detail, we're not adding too much at this point. Just enough. Okay, let's head over here. So here we are, just migrating on over, and like I noted, we like to do a little tap on the left and the right hand side. A lot of the taps towards the top kind of move upwards like a bell shape, the bottom of a bell. And then when we get towards the middle of the tree, it kind of evens out, it flattens, because the branches have so much weight that they can't do that larger movement upwards anymore. And then towards the bottom we get the top of a bell where it kind of dips down and then it comes up. So painting these trees, it's a wide collection of application styles. We try to make our little taps as small as we can. There we go. Might throw in another little tree right here. Just spanning the tops of them slightly. And this is a real process of acceptance. We spend a lot of time on the backgrounds, on the mountains, on the rocks. Now we're covering up portions of them. And that's okay, because we're looking at the painting as a whole. We're saying, you know what? While I like that background, it'll be a lot better if we also have a foreground and a midground. And they cover each other, which gives it depth. Now, of course, you have specific areas that you love that are your favorite. You don't have to cover those. You can move a tree here and there. That's okay. But I do think having that overlap really adds a lot to the pieces. So we're making sure to do that. I also like to make my trees slightly less tall than I think I'm going to want them. That way I have the opportunity to expand them with very small strokes at the end. If you kind of go in and you already apply the top and it's just too big, then you have to extend it to make it smaller. Like here, I'm extending it with a much smaller application. But I intentionally didn't bring it up all that way initially because I just had a feeling my initial marking would probably be a little bit too big. Because we're doing so many of these at the same time and we're not going back to the water and grabbing paint every single time, our marks just aren't as precise as they could be. But when it gets to this point where we're more in a refinement stage, that's when we do have those opportunities to go in with the smallest of applications. We're going to have some open areas of the tree. I always think that's interesting. This one's a bit closer, so it's visually a bit larger. We have little openings in branches, despite the fact that we're not going to see a lot through this. And again, expanding with much smaller markings, or at least attempting to. This almost added a nice little vignette to the painting. It darkens the edges, but in a way that isn't too detailed because there's a lot of overlapping branches which nullify the detail that would be there, right? We can also, if we don't like portions of this, we can go back soon, simply, by reinstigating the sky. I'm just building this bit by bit. Okay, now we're taking a step back and we're going to add some detail and highlight into the silhouetted trees. We're going to mix our pigment, of course, with a larger flat-headed brush, and I'm actually going to mix something very much akin to the darker hue value that we used to create the initial application. However, this time it's going to be a little bit brighter and a little bit more blue. So here, I think we actually have a pretty good mix. We're going to apply it with, yet again, our fan brush. It's fully dry, it's clean. We're going to get all of those different markings. Grab some pigment on both sides. And I'm going to apply this predominantly, initially, on the right-hand side of a lot of these trees. As I run out of paint, I'll move slightly towards the left. But we're just trying to integrate a very small amount of texture and pattern into our trees. And this is just going to look like their branches, they're protruding, they're catching light, not a lot of it, but a little bit, and it's incredibly subtle. Let me get you a bit closer. So here we are, yet again, going in with a fairly vertical application. I like to start towards the tops of the trees when I have the most fresh pigment on my brush, because that's going to give us far more detail. There we go. We're also going to apply some towards the top over here. You can see that I rotate my brush fairly frequently, and that's just to get the pigment on the other side of it. Typically when we paint like this, because our brush is somewhat angled, we're only really getting off the paint from one side. So we make those micro adjustments. And I'm also not pressing the entirety of my brush into the canvas. I'm only about using a third, maybe half at most. And then again, as I start to run out of pigment, I'll just do some loose taps in the negative space. You could also go in with a darker variant of this as well. But the idea is I just want a less opaque, less noticeable marking, despite the fact that this is all very non-noticeable anyway. It's meant to be that way. It's how we keep it subtle. Now when we get over to the right-hand side, I'm still applying this intentionally to the right-hand side of my trees because we would assume that the light is somewhat coming from that direction. Not dramatically so, but a little bit. And we can also incorporate a little bit more on the left-hand side of these two. So it's predominantly on the right-hand side. It's a little bit on the left-hand side on this half of the painting because there's this large opening, and that's going to let extra light just kind of work its way around the bend too. So there's a number of factors going on that are impacting all of this. Let's take a step back, look at it from a bit of an afar. Okay, so this is going to sound maybe a little bit silly, but it's definitely hard to see from farther away, and that's great. That's exactly what we wanted. We wanted something incredibly subtle that just adds a little bit of texture, a little bit of depth, but in a way that isn't distracting or overbearing. This is wonderful. This is exactly what we wanted. If you want it to be a little bit brighter, then you can go in with another layer and build it up. Just be careful to not do too many, because we don't want to obstruct the contrast that we've built now. And we don't want to make the actual shapes of the trees larger than they should be. So you can do that. Just be careful with it. And with that, I'm actually quite happy. So I think we're going to get a little bit tighter and we'll start working on the next step. So now we're going to continue moving down and forward in the painting, and we're going to block in the bit of snow that goes here and then wraps right around the edge. This is going to be an incredibly bright pigment. We're starting with our titanium white. We'll need a little bit of Mars black. We'll need a little bit of cerulean blue, but not much of that Mars black or cerulean blue. We really do want this to be something quite bright, like the snow that we have in the top of the piece. And I'm just going to start by working the snow back here. And then eventually when we get to this side, we're going to start moving it down a little bit. And in front of our tree line. We'll cover up some of our 2B wood, little sticks and different pieces that'll make this much more natural looking. But as you can see, first layer quite thin. We can see portions of the trees underneath, and we're going to make it a lot more lively in subsequent layers. I think I'll add a hint more blue. I'm also going to go in with a very thick amount of paint. Growing a smallest bit of Mars black there. And I want this added cool saturation in the snow, because as we get closer I want to interject slightly more color. We will have all of this blue light reflecting in the piece. But already, as you can see, I think it's looking a lot better. We didn't do much, but it's having an impact. That said, we do need to make it three-dimensional. I'm going to make the sides a little bit darker. Add a hint of Mars black. We'll work that on this right-hand side. Might also have some extra blue in there. Now, this pigment isn't going to be what we have on the canvas because this is all still wet. It's going to blend with what we have. So it'll be a bit brighter here. And then I'll just blend that into the center. You can see the edge is now slightly darker, which makes sense. We have the light coming from here as well. It's having an impact. Might make it slightly more blue. Very softly I'm working it over. That way we get a nice subtle transition. There we go. And I think we'll also make this area a little bit darker too. Definitely back towards the trees, because they can cast a little bit of a shadow. Though this is a bit of a hill, and it will inherently catch extra light just because it's higher up. So we can add some brightness up here. Have it dissipate as we move towards the edge. Have it dissipate as we blend down. We're getting close. Getting close to a good base. Not going for the smoothest of blends, because when we have some line work in there, it looks like there are different planes to the snow, right? It's a bit more texture, there's some volume to it. I like that a lot. Just a little bit over here. Towards the bottom though, so it's the opposite, because the top area, again, should be a bit darker, because it's closer to the trees. There we are. And we can have as much fun with this as we'd like in terms of layering, building. Trying to make it look like there's a little bit of a dip, and then there's more land that protrudes, and it has snow on it, so it's a bit brighter. There we go. Now, once that's dry, we can get a little bit closer, and we'll remix what will essentially be a combination of the darker pigment that we use for our trees and the lighter pigment. We want something right in between, something that fits with both pretty naturally. And that, of course, is going to have quite a bit of cerulean blue in it, titanium white, and Mars black. Then we switch on over to our liner brush, grab some pigment, and with this, I'm just going to start dragging the bases of trees down. And initially it's going to look a little bit awkward, as do a lot of our acrylic applications. We get in place the bottoms of trees, little openings, and all of that. We just want to make sure that Looks like we have some trees in the foreground here, or rather the midground. And I think we'll continue that all the way till about here, for the most part. Now, I have a very watery mixture because I want an incredibly precise marking here. I want it to be sharp on all of the edges. And as a result, I pay the cost of it being incredibly thin. So I'm going to go over these a number of times, make sure they're nice and thick. And then as we get here, we essentially have the snow, well, the trees, they get too far back for us to really see the bottoms. But also here the snow starts to go in front. There's a bit of a hill, right? So we're keeping that in mind. Just getting the side of the canvas a little bit here. I typically like to leave the sides of my canvases looking like canvas, just as a reminder that we are painting. It's a physical medium. We're working with acrylic and canvas, and I like kind of honoring the medium that it is. I know some people like to cover them or paint it black or a hue within the painting, but I've always just loved seeing the raw canvas on the side of a very detailed piece, right? I think it also just accentuates the beauty of the detail and the painting itself. So I do a little bit of an extension, but not too much of one. I just find that middle ground. That said, I think I'm quite happy with what we have down here. So we're going to take a step back. We're going to let this dry. I'll move on to our next step. Okay, so this is all fully dry. Cleaned my brush and my water, and now we're going to create a bit of a blowing snow effect with a hint of Mars Black, a hint of Cerulean Blue, a lot of Titanium White, and we're going to be applying this with the new brush, one we haven't used yet today, that being the filbert brush. And this has a nice round edge, as you can see. So we get this softer aesthetic, great for things like clouds or mist, blowing snow, anything with a really soft blend. Love this brush. And with it, we're going to actually not make it damp. Initially, I'm going to go in with a dry brush effect. And I'm going to apply it along the top of this hill that we have here. And then I'm going to just raise that pigment off of that area with a rounded motion, like so. We let it dissipate as we move up. We let it dissipate as we move down. It's brightening the snow itself while creating a really nice blowing snow effect up against the darker values of the trees. Try to go in with a little bit initially, and then we slowly build it. Now here I'm going to make my brush a little bit damp for the first time. And this is going to move the paint around a bit more. It's going to look softer. We're not going to get that same granular effect to that same level. But we don't want too much water because we don't want to accidentally rip off pigment in all of this rotating application that we have going on here. So we're very measured with it. Also have some great painting ASMR through this, right? Always love that. Starting at the bottom, working our way up. And you know what? I can tell it's starting to rip off a little bit right there. You can see that little open area? That's because there's too much water right there. which is okay. It's happening right here now too. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to finish up softly the edges. Give us something nice and smooth towards the top, a good gradient and transition. And then I'm going to let this area as a whole dry completely. Because going back and trying to work over this right now just isn't really going to work. Same goes for right there. I kind of like this little bit of an opening because it feels like the snow is just skipping an area, like it's going up this little hill and it's catching the air. And there's that little kind of break area, but I feel like that's too much. So I'm going to keep that one, I'm going to go over that one, I'm going to let it all dry. In the meantime, I'm just going to do a little bit, not too much, a little bit over here. And I'm not going to do a lot on this side because I want to do so on this side later once we have the water painted in, because I want that mist going over the water in the distance, or that blowing snow going over the water in the distance over here. So we're just going to do a hint of it. Just soften it so it feels like it fits within the rest of the painting at this point. And then we'll give that probably 5, maybe 10 minutes to dry. Might only need 2 or 3, but I want to give it the extra to make sure that it looks right. Okay, so to be extra safe, I actually waited about 20 minutes. And now that means everything on my palette has fully dried. So we're just going to remix very bright snowy hue, like so. Switch back over to the filbert. And as you can see, in using all of that water, I actually ripped some of the pigment off of the snow. So I'm going to want to cover that up as well in this process. And that's important. So we'll just apply this on there to begin. And you can see it's still showing through. I have to do a couple layers like that, but that's okay, we can layer. Going in with a dry brush. And I have a lot of pigment here. Maybe a little bit too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the excess off on a little painting cloth. And then I'm going to go up and I'm going to blend the rest. Working in a circular pattern with my brush for the most part. There we go. Just soften the top. Let it kind of get lost up there. Now we do need more pigment down here. A little bit of a blend. You can see how it just looks better and better the more we do. And again, I wanted to cover this area which had that ripped paint, even on the top. So, just add those layers. I kind of like it here, but now that we've added more of that snow towards the top, I think there just needs to be a hint more towards the bottom as well. And you can see the more I work it, it kind of takes that off. So we do have to be careful. I'm probably going to let this dry, do it one more time, and then we'll move on to the next step, which will have some pretty nice intricate details for the painting. So we're taking a step back, and as you can see, I've redrawn in a lot of the little sticks and whatnot that we have in the foreground. We're going to paint those using an abundance of our Mars Black, a little bit of our Titanium White, and you guessed it, a little bit of our Cerulean Blue. Now we want this mixture to be even darker than what we have in the trees. So I'm mixing that right next to that previous mixture, and this looks like it's just about there. Though, we'll be applying the actual pigment with the smallest brush we have, that being the liner. I'm going to make sure it's nice and damp to condense those bristles. And I'm going to pick up a very small amount of paint with the brush because these need to be incredibly small applications. Going in with as little pressure as I possibly can, barely touching the canvas, just like that. Now, we're going to expand upon these in dramatic ways as we continue, but I want to start with something that's a little bare. That way we can look at it as a whole and decide where we want to apply the more thick, the more full, the more developed areas of these branches. I'm also not grabbing too much water because even too much water can expand your application. I'm looking for a real balance here. Portions are semi-transparent, that's also okay because it'll just look like it's thin, light's bouncing on it, maybe there's some ice on it, and that's also having an impact, right? Could have snow. It's a little bit more thick. So, just going over my drawing. And again, you can find the traceable, the drawing up over on Patreon. Patreon's a great way to support the channel. It's a great way of just saying a little thank you for the lessons if you'd like to, but no worries if you can't. Up there you can also find the reference photos and images of all of my materials so that you know that you're working with exactly the same paints and brands that I am. I also have a bunch of bonus lessons up there. Ones that aren't here on YouTube, and some of them are even really big. I have some 24 by 36 inch canvas lessons. So if you want to go really big, that's where you can find that. Often broken up into 6 or 7 lessons. But really get to dive into the details and all of the minute application options. There you can also get my ebooks, which includes Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump in. We talk about brushes, water, mixing different pigments, the colors, composition, all of that good stuff. There are also a bunch of ebooks full of additional traceables for those uninspired days. Some of landscapes, some of flowers. I also have a Facebook group you can get access to and share your work in. Get feedback from an incredibly wonderful, supportive community. So there's a lot of good stuff up there, if you're interested. But again, you can get the traceable there. And that's where we started this conversation. Here I'm slowly just expanding upon our branches. And I think they add a lot of depth to this painting. Really make you feel like finally getting forward. And we'll just apply some of the smallest little taps and markings. The smaller you get, the more scale you add to the big ones. So these little bits are actually quite important. A lot of crisscrossing, a lot of cross-hatching. I think that is having a great impact on the painting as a whole. You can see I'm kind of moving from one side to the other. Slowly just adding smaller branches to our smaller branches. You can even expand it up to the point where we don't really recognize the markings anymore because they blend in with that of the trees. It's not a bad thing. I think it actually looks very natural. And here I want to do a bit of crisscrossing. If we don't have any of that, it makes the trees, the branches, all of it look a little bit flat. We don't want that. There we go. Apologies if my hand is in the way here and there. I do need a lot of control in this, and often that control comes from being able to move your brush in different intentional ways, right? Sometimes it's kind of mandatory. And I'm trying to add these little taps not only on the line in which the foliage or the branches come out, but also above and below. That's very important. You're going to want to expand on this in your own way too, depending upon your preference of how tidy or dramatic you want it to look. I like that a lot. There's definitely room for more, but I don't want to overdo it at this point. I think we'll just do slightly more. Then we'll take a break from this area, move on to our next step, and then we can come back to this a little bit later, should we feel like we want that extra detail. I say that, and then I have a really hard time putting the brush down. It's just a lot of fun painting these. Yeah. Okay. I think we're getting really close to the next step. Oh, I love that. Okay, that was a good idea. I really like bringing these two together. What if we just made this a little bit wider? Yeah. Okay, great. And on to the next step. So the next step is a big one. We're going back to the larger flat-headed brush, and we're going to block in this very large, almost half of the canvas. I'm going to do so by matching the highlights essentially in the sky through here, and then we're going to make it a little bit darker as we move down. We're going to have a darker, significantly darker hue for the edges, somewhat akin to what we have there. I'm going to start with the brighter mid portion, just because it's a lot easier to make our mixes darker than it is lighter in general. So we're going to begin with a little bit of Mars Black, a little bit of Cerulean Blue. Everything on my palette has dried, by the way, so I don't have to worry about that. And we're going to begin by just applying this right down here in the middle, like so. It's not quite as bright as the highlights in the snow, but it's fairly close to the mid values there. And we'll just start bringing that downwards until we get around the opening. Now we'll make it a bit darker and a bit more blue. We want it to have some good saturation as we're moving closer to us in the foreground and we can really open up our saturation through there. Need a lot of paint, so we're not mixing with little bits at this point. And we'll go slightly darker as well. Not going with the first pigment we mix, but refining until we get what we actually want. And that's perfect. Okay, so we're going to bring this all the way over here, all the way over here. And then we'll subtly blend into the blue that we have pre-established above. Just like so. Now we'll get even darker. More Mars Black, more Cerulean Blue. Really doubling down on the Cerulean Blue. And yet again, that is what we want. We're getting lucky with our mixes. That said, we should probably do 2 layers, maybe 3, just to make it nice and thick. Though, do really like where we're landing with our colors. So, let's go again. And I think I want to be a bit darker over here. Being very soft with my brush to not have too many streaks, though it's okay to have some. Next we'll go significantly darker, much more akin to what we have over here, and I think I'll actually start this mix a bit closer to this, just so we have that visual reference. Again, good amount of blue. Then we'll just apply this through here. That said, this is going to be a little bit interesting in that we're going to want to move it in there naturally. I think we need to go a bit brighter. I'm looking at it in the viewfinder of the camera, which essentially lets me look at it from a real distance. And you know what? I'm going to do maybe. No, you know what? This is good. This is good. This is much better. See that? It's a bit more gray. It's a bit more akin to what we have up top there. And then through there, we're just going to work our way into the back. Create a good little movement. We'll be doing a lot of detail work over this, so don't worry. The current aesthetic is not close to the final aesthetic. We are just blocking things in at this point. Still have a good amount of water on my brush, so I'm doing the edges while I can. And then once those are done, we can be a bit more volume focused by working in the bigger areas. Now I do have quite a bit of water on my brush, which I do have to be careful with, because I don't want to thin this too much, but again, multiple layers will fix just about all. I'm going to mirror what we have going on up here to a better degree. Right now I'm okay with somewhat less defined edges. We're just looking for those general shapes. There we go. Much better. And if we can get a little bit of a fuzzy look, that also isn't a bad thing at all. Going back, doing a bit of a second layer. Refining shapes where we need to. Just like that. Trying to paint from a bit of a distance. I think I just needed to move this a little bit more to the left, but again, you can just use the traceable. That'll make it a lot easier. I'm kind of having fun figuring it out in the way that I am though. And maybe I'll just soften a little bit of this with a very damp brush. A lot of water on my brush right now, for the sake of getting a wet into dry blend with the previous mixture. And I like that softer look a lot. It's like it's just getting lost up here, right? Very good. Okay, let's get you a bit closer. Okay, now we're going to get a bit closer, and we're actually going to remix the pigment that we used, the brightest pigment that we used for the water here. And I think we're pretty close. I think it just needs a bit more titanium white. And then we're going to switch our brush over to the liner. Make sure that's nice and damp. Pick up some pigment. Do a little test, make sure we have the right pigment. It just has to be close, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then we're going to create some very small line work that comes out of this middle bright portion. This will have a big effect fast, which is great, always makes us feel good. And the water is going to be moving in a lot of different directions, right? Because some of it's higher up, there are different little current structures, and when that happens, we need to be pretty mindful of how we make these markings. They're not all just going to be horizontal, and they start to curve this way as we get farther up. Doing lots of tiny ones in addition to the larger ones. You're going to need it to be a bit more opaque when we create that transition, because we don't want that darker line somewhat showing through. And eventually, it won't take too long, but eventually we are going to get to a place where this highlight that matches this no longer matches this portion, because it is always changing. It's getting darker as we move down, but it's okay to continue moving this highlight over that. And I'm also going to create those markings in the middle here. So let's just double down on the opacity of a portion or two. And again, lots of movements like this. Then they are going to start turning, and we're going to eventually get ones that move almost in this formation. And I'll paint these in now, despite the fact this is a little bright, because I'm using a very watery mixture and it isn't as visually bright as the pigment, because we have that darker value showing through, right? So, lots of little bits of water. It's only one side. Let's move on over to the other. And again, we get an effect very quickly, which is so rewarding. With this, we're actually going to move it from something horizontal that kind of moves back. There's almost a little bit of a spiral effect through here that I see in the reference photo. By spiral, I just mean it's more of a circular, the water's moving in a almost a rhythmic pattern. Extremely transparent. And right about here is where we have a lot of reflective movement. I'm almost going to draw a line. It's not going to quite be a line, but it's a very choppy line. We're actually going to brighten everything in here with a wash once this dries. We're going to take a little bit of a break for a number of millimeters. Then we're going to go back up here and just do a little similar reflection of the snow, the lip of the snow. But there's a bit of a break as noted. There we go. And I'm doing little taps. And that's just going to make the water look like it's a bit more playful. A lot of people ask, how do I paint mountains? How do I paint clouds, water, all of that? And often the answer is that there isn't one way. There's 100 different ways, and they're all going to be dependent on the wind, the lighting, the perspective, the age of the subject itself, the brushes and the techniques that you want to incorporate with the actual finished style that you intend to render. So we need to just be cognizant of the fact that the way in which we apply it will probably change pretty consistently. And that's okay. Just letting this work its way to the right hand side within that somewhat drawn line. I think I'm actually going to bring this all the way to the edge, but you can see that it's getting darker and darker. That's because I'm slowly running out of water and pigment. And I'm not forcing it. So we're just going to let that do that. And I might make some elongated strokes that kind of connect with this larger movement and push to simplify the edge. Give the viewer's eye a bit of a rest. And use these almost as leading lines to point you in to the detailed area where your eye is capable of settling. Now we'll take a healthy step back, and I think that's all coming together quite well. From there, we're going to mix up more of our mid blue, the one that we have in between the highlight and the darker hues. And I think that just had a bit more Mars black, a bit more cerulean blue. We still want a good amount. We have quite the area to cover. And back to the liner brush. Now here, let's try to find that hue, and this is actually quite a bit darker than I initially expected. And we can actually use this a bit higher up. We're going to have a movement in the water that kind of goes like this towards the bottom. So let's just start instigating that. As you can see, not too tricky. And I'm also going to work into the left-hand side as the pigment starts to dissipate. So already getting some movement and detail closer to the foreground. Looking for that opening. We can just start placing little lines through there. And then there's an interesting additional movement that kind of goes over here. Feels a little bit random, but to be honest, this is one of those situations where I look at the reference photo and I just trust it. I see that it's happening in nature, I see that it's real, So there has to be some justification for the general movements that I'm just not currently privy to, right? That's okay. Instead, we are going to use this to cut some of the darker movements inwards. And it's always interesting because it's darker up here, but it's lighter down here. It's all dependent on environment, right? Let's try to get that middle pigment though, that we were initially working towards. So go back to more titanium white, more cerulean blue, still a little bit of Mars black. No, that's important. Let's give this a test. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so we found it. Second time's the charm. Now with this, we never really did finish this side, though we've done more with it, so I think just for completion's sake, compartmentalizing all of that, we're going to head over here for a minute. Bring this together to a greater degree. Again, find this opening, which will be a little bit brighter. We've already sketched this in using the darker pigment. It's almost not visible now that it's dry. We don't have that light reflecting on the water and the wet pigment. However, we can still use it to chart our course for these markings, right? And this is something that we can even build up over time through many layers. And all of these layers, much like the mountains, will add up to a really beautiful piece. It's about having that patience. And we can even take this highlight, use it to wrap some of the water around here, which, as you can see, is still doing a bit of a rotation in general. Less noticeable towards the top, as it is brighter. We can go for something nice and subtle initially. No rush to make it really pop, right? And we're building all of this great pattern already. Just naturally find ourselves on the other side. Let's get you a bit closer. So now let's head back into this together. Same pigment, still completing this area, building up opacities. And it's not always a line, sometimes it is just a little tap. I think the taps add a world of difference, especially when we're elongating the reflective pieces. It just adds a bit of a shimmer to the water. Adds an extra level of detail and scale, which makes the larger movements like these much more prominent and have more standing in terms of their movement. Now, this all looks quite bright right now, but remember, we are working with acrylics. It is wet. The water in it is currently catching light, and therefore it is visually brighter right now than it actually will be when it dries, and by quite a bit. I'm going to do more taps over here, so this dissipates, runs out. We have less of this towards the back because we're just not going to see that detail in the water from a distance. Not really, not to the same extent. But here, just adding little taps into pre-existing lines. Very good. Let's brighten it up just a hint. Just a hint. We'll double down on some of the more prominent pieces towards the highlighted edge. Just make sure we have a good healthy transition. Then we can bring a little bit of highlight down. You can see that there's the darker portions, which is great because they make it look like there's a shadow. Part of the water is rising and then falling, and that falling part is a bit darker. Where the highlight is the raised portion. And together, they create something of depth. Okay, now we're just taking a step back so we can look at the level of detail here in relation to what we have at the top, make sure that it's still well balanced, and I think that so far I'm a fan. I like it. This is going to look a lot better once we introduce some mist and soften this edge, kind of make these not feel so separated. Same with over here. We do need to finish the intricate details in the water first. So far so good. Let's get a little bit closer. So heading on over to the other side now. Yet again, very important for us to look for patterns and general movements. And I can tell one that's pretty dominant through here in the reference photo. And it kind of moves this way. So it's almost as if there's this circular rounded motion as a whole. So I'm going to just begin to craft that. Series of taps and dots. Let it raise through there. And we're actually going to move almost entirely over this darker portion with very thin markings. This is pretty bright for this, but I think it's okay because we're using a lot of water, and as this dries it's going to get darker. A little bit less saturated as it sits on top of a fairly desaturated area as a whole. And then as we get closer to us, we kind of complete that circular spherical motion. There are some little taps up here, which don't necessarily connect to this bottom movement. Not noticeably so. Not dramatically so, but still there, still having an impact. Now we can move up a bit, just continue these larger transitions and movements. You can tell there's also a little almost trail visually that goes up here. So we'll just play with that. And then it's a bit darker through here, but we still need some of these interjections, some of these little pieces of highlight which move in. You can double down on this as it dries, at least portions of it. This is all starting to dry, and because of that, it's getting darker, and we now have an opportunity to go back in and highlight the areas that we really want to pop out. We can also take this pigment and start connecting it with what we have over on the left-hand side through these rotational little movements. This is where it's going to start coming together. Need a bit more water on my brush. You can tell it's a bit chalky there. Don't want that. Some of my markings are long, some are short. Keeping the general movements very intentional, the general structure of the water, but the actual applications are a bit more playful and loose, and intentionally so. That way we don't build too many purposeful patterns which make the piece look less organic, less natural. There we go. Definitely getting somewhere. And then in the reference photo, I can tell it's actually much darker down here, but I think I like the movement, I like the water. I'm going to take an artistic liberty, and I'm going to do a bit more down here than what's shown in the photo. I like to use reference photos to give me ideas and make sure that things look more realistic than my innate understanding of them. However, I also think that often we can edit reference photos to look even better in a painting. We can fix compositions or leading lines, balance colors to a greater degree, add more detail, sometimes reduce detail. We have some very subtle impressions in here. I have almost no pigment left on my brush. It's almost just water, which is why I feel so free in working in these open spaces. Do so a little bit over here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a step back here. We're going to mix a blue that's in between these two. So still avoiding the burnt sienna. I haven't used that in a really long time. That's really just something we use in the mountains of the painting. And often we want to take those colors from the top and move them down. That way we don't kind of visually split the painting in half, but I think the mist will blend everything well to the point where it'll be okay. We'll take this mid blue, this mid darker blue, and now we can incorporate this more so into the middle and continue some of the movements that we've started with the highlights, and we apply this in a very similar way to our past applications. A lot of opportunities to tap, a lot of opportunities to do slight drags. It's all just going to act as little shadows for the water to go up and down. There we go. That's pretty. And if you do too much, it's okay, because we can always go back with the highlights. Build those layers. Might not have to, but it's an option. Right? Now we have a lot of detail throughout some major portions of the painting. It's turning out pretty pretty. Let's go back to a bit more highlight. Don't normally mix with the smaller liner brush, but because we don't need a lot of paint for this subject, it's okay. Just make sure you clean it well. It doesn't have any of that excess mixed pigment on it, so you still get a fine, sharp marking. And now, as I noted, we can go back and build the highlights to the areas we just interjected. Lots of movement in that water. It's subtle, but it's a lot of movement. It was nice and natural, nice and cool. I think it really captures the spirit of the piece and the atmosphere. That's always the biggest goal with painting our subjects, right? It's personifying the atmosphere and building on the feeling that the piece is intended to invoke. There we go. Okay, like that a lot. I think we're going to let the majority of this dry. This is already dried to a point, so you know what? Make a very watery mid-blue, incredibly watery. We just want it to be essentially a wash. This needs to be fully dry before we do this, but mine is. So I'm going to go on with a little bit of water. I'm going to start from here. You don't have to do this. I recommend watching me do it first. This part of the water just has a bit of a sheen to it from the light. And it follows through to here. So by going in with a very watery application, we create a wash or a glaze, something that typically just changes the hue, but in this case, we are trying to alter the value to be a little bit brighter. Don't typically recommend blending with your finger. Doing some finger painting, necessary. We all do it. It's a part of painting, has been since we were young, right? But you have to be careful when you do, because your hands have a lot of oils on them, and you want to make sure that you're not applying those oils to the painting. If you do, you can make areas difficult to adopt paint. Now, I wash my hands very thoroughly, soap beforehand, so I don't have a lot of those oils built up on my hands, and I'm able to do a bit of this finger painting. But just be cognizant of when you are. And we're just adding different sheens, building up the brightest in the various values. There we go. Now typically it's not meant to alter details, right? Because we're just playing with hue often. But here, because we are adapting the value, a lot of the highlights that we had in there are essentially getting lost because we're matching that value. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to re-tap some of our more prominent highlights, slightly brighter hue, value with my filbert. And when I say filbert, I mean liner. By the way, if you want to work with the exact same brushes that I'm using in this lesson, there's a link to them in the video description. It's all from my brush set. It's the brush set I use for all of the acrylic longer lessons here on this channel. And it's one of those things where if you get it, you know that you'll have the right tools for all of my videos where I work with acrylics. So it just makes that easy. You don't have to worry if your brush is too big or too thick, or if it's a soft, medium, or stiff bristled brush. It just works. Ooh, I like that. I like that a lot. It needs to be a bit more subtle. So I took some of that pigment off. but it's a great movement. It works in and out. It's a good leading line, draws the eye into the painting. This is where I deviate from the reference photo a bit, and I just kind of play with my image and make it the best that it can be. Like so. Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that a lot. Doing a bit of a painting from a distance here, with the purpose of filling out compositional issues, or areas that could just be slightly better. So I'm trying to paint a little bit farther away. And we're going to let all of this dry before we go in and add our mist and our blowing snow. You can kind of use those words interchangeably in a piece like this. Could be fog. Okay. This is something that I could just do forever, so I'm going to let it dry, and then we will come back together and we'll apply the next step. Now, as I was waiting for the piece to dry, I realized there were a couple things I wanted to add before we did the mist. First, I think we need a little bit of a reflection of the snow, the lip of it, in the water. So we're just going to grab a little bit of our Cerulean blue, a lot of titanium white. We'll switch on over to our filbert brush because we want a nice soft blend with this. And we can see that it protrudes through here. I'm going to create just a slight separation between the edge of the water and the reflection, as you can see. Very subtle. We're just going to bring this out, and then we'll blend it softly downwards. Really not much to this. We can build up the area that's closest to the edge a couple of times. And you can see that I'm a bit more soft right underneath the areas that'll have a bit of a darker reflection to them. Now this doesn't need to be excessively bright, but I do think it will have a good impact as a whole. A subtle one, but a good one. Just like so. Okay, now that we've incorporated that, let's grab our liner brush, hint of Mars black, Cerulean blue, titanium white, remix the color of these, and we'll just do a small reflection of the more prominent areas. Remember, we're covering this with quite a bit of mist later on, so it doesn't have to be perfect, and we can be somewhat playful with it, but we do want hints of it, like so. Definitely adds to the realism. Now we'll also take that liner brush, mix up a fairly bright gray, bluish gray, of course. And I think we'll add a little bit of snow, just a small patch of it right here in the water. You can see it in the reference photo and I like it a lot. And we can add little movements of water around it. Good addition. Soften that. We can add little protruding pieces of snow out into the distance here. And I think that's a strong addition. Doesn't take much work, but it adds a lot of depth and scale. We do a couple just scattered about. I like how that balances the piece a lot. Let's go with something a little bit brighter. Just grab some extra titanium white, throw that on the top of the snow. That way we have some depth. Here's some highlight. Light's rolling off of it. Doesn't have to be dramatic. There we go. There's also one right here in the reference photo, but I don't think I'm going to paint that. And going back to the darker pigments, I think I just want to cut into this backing snow a little bit more. Maybe even bring it back to the trees to a point. Oh yeah, I love that. Added so much depth. Detail. Very good. There we are. See? A little bit of time, a little bit of extra effort. World of difference in the painting. You know, I like these ones so much over here. I think we'll drop a couple a bit closer to us. This isn't with the brightest of pigments, this is pre-highlight. There we go. Kind of feels like they're leading us into the painting, right? Again, you don't have to do these. They're not in the photo, they're not mandatory, but you can add more or less of them depending upon how you want it to look, what you want your painting to be like. There's no right or wrong here. There's things that will technically work towards the grander composition of the painting, but we can take liberties and break rules and do all of that here. Now we go in with the brighter mix, extra titanium white. Add that to the tops. Give it that necessary depth. Now when we add the mist over all of this, it's going to look great. Then we'll grab a slightly darker mix. For the water, which will wrap around all of these, right? Because if we add them, it does change how the water moves a little bit. And we just want to make sure that we imply that movement properly. Not too tricky. Okay, now we can get closer again. We'll mix a very bright pigment and a good abundance of it for our mist in the background, our blowing snow. We will, of course, be applying it with our filbert brush. And I'm going to start right in the middle, right in the center, where the land meets the water. We'll bring that all the way back. We're going to move it forward a little bit, let it dissipate, move it up a little bit, let it dissipate. My applications just get softer as I move up and as I move down. Might work in a bit of an X-shaped pattern just to move the pigment about. We're not looking for any line work though. We want it all to be fairly soft. As you can see, that really pushed it into the distance, which is very much our goal. Now we can grab a bit more, and I'm just going to add a bit of that blowing snow here in the foreground as well. It'll soften a lot of the branches nicely. It'll create some good connective tissue between the top and the bottom. We don't need to do too much, but we can go over this a second time. Again, we always want to do just a little bit to begin, and then we slowly build. That said, I don't think we need to build much. We're pretty close, so it's more difficult to gauge when you are at that distance from the canvas, but I think if we pull back, we'll really like it. And just like that, I think it's already looking a lot better. Now, while we let that dry, figure out if that's really as much as we want, we're going to move into our negative space. We're going to continue working with a fairly bright pigment. This time, however, a little bit more of our blue, a little bit more of our Mars black. We need a lot more actual paint though. Because it is a fairly large area, we want a thick layer to begin. We are going to build on it, we are going to add highlights, but we need a good base. I think this is great. There's room to get brighter, but it still has that gray blue. Going to shape some of the edges. You could again just redraw this from the traceable, but I'm taking a look at it right now and I think I can just sketch it with my brush. There we go. Then we have another protruding portion that sticks out like this. Nice and easy. There's another bit of snow right down here. And this will be the darker hue value for the majority of it. We do need to let that dry, but it is a fairly impactful application as it means that we've covered the entirety of the canvas now with pigment. And that's always a celebratory moment in my mind. Just doing a bit of a second layer, building up these applications. Might even make it slightly darker while it's still wet. I'm not going to do this to the entirety of the mix. I want to keep some of it so that I can use it as a reference for how bright we need to go. But I do think I'll add a little bit of a darker application to the backs of some of the protruding areas, so the left-hand side, and then just kind of little random splotches in between. It's very subtle, but already provides a little bit of volume. We are going to go in with some real highlights, though, that will make it much more interesting, much more distinct. I'm just kind of building our option for that in doing this. And it's all still wet, so I'm just playing. The darker we make this, the more opportunity we have for high contrast snow, which isn't necessary, but isn't bad. We are on the foreground. We do have that opportunity. So I think we'll let that dry just a little bit, and then we'll move in quite a bit closer. Okay, so it's had some time to dry. We're now going to mix up an even brighter blue than that which we used for the initial base. Still using hints of Mars Black and Cerulean, but this is more titanium white. It's not a pure titanium white, and it does have room to become even brighter. I'm going to go in with the filbert because I want to be able to blend softly. Here, Floyd's coming this way for the most part. We're going to have the highlights towards the top and on the right hand side of these bumps, of these protrusions, right? So we'll just do that. We'll do little taps. We'll start doing blends backwards and around. Let it softly walk into the distance. But you can tell how just a couple of layers, one darker, one mid, one light, can very quickly render the aesthetic of snow. I'm trying to work around the darker portions, use those as areas that look like drop-offs and shadows. There are highlights, but of various degrees. This is also incredibly important. It's almost in the center of the canvas. So I'll make sure we do a good job up here. Build up our highlight. Be a bit brighter. Go back in, especially along those edges. And then the other areas that again stick out, then fall back. Then once we have the larger areas implemented, as we almost do here, we're going to switch our brush to the smaller liner, where we can do just little taps in the highlights for the most part. And this will give the snow miniature protrusions and some extra texture, some repetition, some pattern, which will complement the water extremely well. This is really what turns the snow into something that has a lot more realism, though. The other layers are about building form. This one is about making it really look like snow. One of those things that actually took me a long time to learn. I didn't realize we could do this for snow for years of painting. And then when I realized, oh no, you just pick up the liner brush and you do the little taps, and it makes a world of difference. Extremely pleased. See that? Looks like there are lots of little areas that are catching reflections and that light is bouncing around. That said, this only works for the foreground. Don't do it in the background. You probably shouldn't do it in the background. Don't like to talk with certainty about what you should and shouldn't do in art. But I would advise typically against doing it in the background because, let's just do that, because it's such a sharp detail. In real life, you really only see it in the foreground. The detail gets lost in the distance, for the most part. And you can add a lot of this, or you can add a little bit. I'm opting for more, but as my brush runs out of paint, it just becomes very watery. I get these more subtle applications, which I like a lot, so I can work them into the shadows to a point. There we go. Alright, so stepping back, as you can see, I've gone ahead and redrawn in a lot of the smaller sticks, twigs that we have in the foreground, and it's time to start painting those. Now we're going to use a lot of Mars Black, a good amount of Cerulean Blue, and a hint of Titanium White. We really want this to be the brightest, rather, the darkest pigment that we've used. We still wanted to have a hint of blue because we want it to be a cooler hue, which does fit within the rest of the painting. And of course we are applying this with one of two brushes. We can use our smaller flathead, or we can use our liner. I'm going to start with a liner, and with this I'm going to take my pinky finger, I'm going to brace it on part of my easel. This just eliminates some shake from my hand. And with these, you want to create a lot of very sharp movements. I think often these look a little bit awkward when we try to add a lot of bends to them. Bends can work, but I would use them less frequently, essentially. With these smaller ones, we really need to apply as little pressure as possible. Of course, it'll be much more noticeable on the snow than it is over the darker portions of water. But we don't need to see the entirety of these all the time, right? It's not a necessity. In fact, it looks better when occasionally it just gets a bit more subtle. And I have my drawing in here, but I do expand upon it in unique ways. Try not to grab too much pigment with my brush, because while the brush may be damp, while we may apply a small amount of pressure, when we have a lot of pigment on there, we are forced to make a larger marking, right? So here we're just being careful, not doing too much. Lots of little taps for smaller protruding pieces. I think that goes to add a lot. It's a lot like the taps in the water that look like the shimmer. So, kind of going back to that idea of how do you paint this, how do you paint that, a lot of these subjects actually have very similar techniques, but we use different hues, different patterns, and therefore we arrive at different visual renditions of textures. And that's what separates our subjects, along with their values and their hues. But the actual application process there are a lot of commonalities. Here, as you can see, we are just working our way over to the right-hand side. Have to do a number of them a couple of times just because of the amount of water I'm working with, but that's okay. I like that one. Kind of goes off of the canvas in two different areas. It's very dynamic. Alludes to a larger landscape. The smaller we make these dots and lines, the more scale we add to the ones that are pre-existing. We've talked about that before in relation to other subjects, but it's very much true here too. So when I get in a good groove of applying very tiny markings, I like to go back to other areas. And to be honest, I feel like with every application, I can't get there. It needs to be just the perfect mix of water and pigment. So when that lightning strikes, I take advantage of it. That's what we're doing right here. Making sure that they crisscross other branches, like so. You know what, let's make this one change a little bit, make it a bit more unique. We can even make these fairly high should we want to, provided they're nice and small. I like that a lot. I think this one over here could use a bit more, but can't use a lot of pigment. Need to make very small markings, and we'll see if we are in a good spot for that. We're not really, so I'm going to instead use this mix to double down on some of the larger areas. There we go. I like that. Let's grab our pigment. Head all the way over here on the right hand side. Because while this won't show up dramatically, it will have an impact. Remember that your branches should get larger as we move towards the bottom of them. So we can apply a bit more pressure with our brush. Build something more thick like that. And you know what? I just realized for the entirety of this, you've been pretty far away. So I'll tell you what, once I'm done this branch right here, I'll get you quite a bit closer. So here, as noted, we're just going to grab a bit more of that pigment, bracing my pinky finger on part of my easel, and we'll just work down these drawn lines, which for the most part are fairly straight. I found that over here, kind of struggled to get a really small marking. Still waiting for that magic little mix to happen. And of course we can keep playing with it. We can keep altering it until we get there. But there's so much left to do in terms of larger applications that I'm not really putting the extra effort into getting to that mix right now. And I think that's okay. We'll get there when we need to. Might just land on it. Oh, this is very good. This is nice and smooth. There we go. Back back to the smaller ones. And here, we are going to intentionally make it so. So I'm just going to move some paint over to the side. And I'm doing this so that I don't have too much paint. Here you can see there's some texture to it. Sometimes that means there's a lot. We don't want to pick up a lot. So I'll just grab a little bit with a fairly damp brush, but not a wet brush, just a damp brush. And just like that. Perfect, it worked. We have these incredibly tiny markings, which are perfect for building out the realism in these branches. We are being extremely careful at this point. You don't want to overdo it. There we go. Create depth when we apply it over other subjects. Let's create another one that kind of bends its way back in. Yeah. Incredibly small and smooth. Once we try for it. Okay, let's take a step back. Let's take a look at it as a whole. Just making this joint a little bit sharper. Okay, perfect. These are a little bit more thick than what we have over here, and intentionally so, just because we don't have a lot of contrast. So I'm creating an additional force of recognition to that area because it's larger. So that's how we're kind of balancing both sides. And when we step back, I realized I didn't do this one. I drew it in, but I didn't paint it in. So we're just going to work this guy up there. We can also see where a lot of these originate from, which means that they are a little bit farther away. They're close, but they are farther away, and that's going to make them visually smaller perspective-wise, right? Where these, we can't see that base, so hypothetically they're closer to us, and therefore will appear larger. With that, we are going to just continue these little branches. I like that one a lot. I think we need to make the base slightly bigger. And we can begin from here. Again, I always like to make them smaller initially. It's a lot easier to make them bigger than it is smaller. There we go. That looks good. Might even do another piece that comes up out of there. This is where we get a bit more experimental with it. But towards the ends of these lessons, I always like to give you a little keyword, something you can use in the comments to know that you are, on average, part of the 13% who makes it to the end of these longer videos. Using the code word, it's kind of like a little badge of honor. I and everybody else who gets here knows that you are, again, part of that 13%. And today, I think our code word is going to be flow. There's a real flow to the water. It's subtle, it's soft. Maybe you could use the word in a sentence related to your flow in painting. But you can either just type the word or you can incorporate it in a sentence. It's always fun to see who continuously gets the words from lesson to lesson. And again, if you're interested, you can get the traceable up over on Patreon. You can also find all of the pictures of the materials, bonus lessons, big 24 by 36 inch canvases. Up there you can also get all of my ebooks, access to our exclusive Facebook group where you can share your work with other community members. There's a lot of fun stuff up there, and it's just a great way to support the channel if you can. But that'll be linked in the description. You can also find the brushes that I use for these lessons in the description. And with that, I think that just about concludes our lesson for today. So I hope you had a great time. Hope you feel like you learned a lot. This was a pretty long one. A lot of detail, a lot of time spent on these subjects, but there's a real pleasure to do so. I hope you feel inspired. I hope you feel ready to go out and paint, or maybe you're just watching this to relax, and that's okay too. Regardless, I hope you're in a good place. I hope you have a wonderful Sunday. If you're watching this the day that this comes out, often these lessons do come out on a Sunday. I feel like that's just the best day for it, right? That's when I think we really get a chance to sit down. Saturdays, sometimes it's about going out and doing something, celebrating after the weekends or getting different chores and whatnot done. But Sunday, typically a day to relax. So I hope you are relaxing. I hope you have a lot of fun. I will see you very soon with another new lesson. Really feeling like doing another seascape. But with that, I'll see you soon. And above all, as always, stay creative.